Somewhere right now, a Windows 11 PC is wasting electricity on services nobody asked for. It's running Bing searches you never typed. It's syncing a OneDrive account you never use. It's pushing Copilot prompts into a start menu that used to just open your apps. And somewhere else, a small group of developers looked at that same operating system and asked one brutally simple question. What if we just removed all of it? Not asked Microsoft. Not waited for permission, just removed it. That project is called AtlasOS, and right now it is quietly becoming one of the most talked about Windows modifications in the world. Here's the part that should make you stop and think. Windows 11 is, by most installed base measurements, running on well over 1 billion devices. It is one of the most resource-rich software products ever built, backed by $1 trillion company, an army of engineers, and more user feedback data than almost any consumer product in history. And yet, the single most requested feature among power users, gamers, and IT professionals for the last several years has been something Microsoft has consistently refused to deliver in full. A clean, lightweight, bloat-free version of its own flagship operating system. Not a hidden setting, not a registry hack buried 6 menus deep, an actual official lightweight Windows. Microsoft has never shipped one. And that gap, that refusal, is exactly the space AtlasOS walked into. Let that sit for a second, because it's stranger than it sounds. Companies usually build what their most engaged users want, especially when those users are the loudest, most technical, most influential voices online. But Windows hasn't gotten lighter over the years. It has gotten heavier. More background services, more bundled apps, more AI features baked into the shell whether you want them or not, more telemetry, more recommended content surfacing inside your own start menu. Each new version adds weight, and each new version makes the removal of that weight a little harder for the average person to do themselves. So a vacuum formed. And vacuums, in tech as in everything else, eventually get filled by someone. That someone turned out to be a community project, not a corporation. AtlasOS isn't built in a boardroom. It's built by an open source community, visible on GitHub for anyone to inspect, audit, and contribute to. And here's where it gets worse for the narrative Microsoft would probably prefer. AtlasOS isn't some shady, hacked-together ISO floating around shady forums. It operates entirely within Microsoft's own licensing terms. It doesn't redistribute a modified Windows image. It doesn't pirate anything. It takes a clean, official, fully licensed Windows 11 installation, and then applies a structured set of changes on top of it using its own tooling. Think about what that means. This isn't an act of piracy chipping away at Microsoft's product. It's a transparent, rules-respecting demonstration that the bloated experience millions of people tolerate every day was never a technical necessity. It was a choice. So how does it actually work? This is where most people get the wrong picture, so let's be precise. AtlasOS is not a separate operating system in the way Linux is a separate operating system. You don't download an AtlasOS ISO and boot into something foreign. What you do is install a completely clean copy of Windows 11, deliberately skip the early setup steps that would connect you to the internet and pull down Microsoft's default configuration, and then run a tool the project built called the AME Wizard. AME standing for the ameliorated project this effort grew out of. That wizard applies what the community calls playbooks, which are essentially structured scripts that strip, disable, and reconfigure specific parts of Windows in a controlled, repeatable, and reversible where possible way. And once you see the list of what those playbooks actually touch, you start to understand why this thing has built such a devoted following. Microsoft Edge, gone, replaced by an alternative browser like Brave by user choice. Bing integration inside the Start menu and taskbar search, disabled. File search inside the Start menu, the thing that quietly slows down so many Windows machines as it indexes your drive in the background, turned off, transforming the Start menu into something closer to a fast, keyboard-driven app launcher, the kind of tool power users usually have to install separately. System animations, the small visual flourishes that look nice on a flagship gaming rig but add friction on older hardware, disabled. The power plan, replaced with one tuned specifically to prioritize responsiveness over Microsoft's more conservative defaults. And underneath all of that, a long list of telemetry services, background tasks, and phone home components most users never knew existed or simply switched off. Now here's where the story stops being a list of tweaks and starts becoming something bigger. The project's own claims are bold. According to the team behind AtlasOS, the changes can push idle CPU usage down to something close to 0, cut RAM usage roughly in half on some systems, and in certain games, improve frame rates by more than 50%. Read that again. 50% on the same hardware, running the same Windows 11 underneath. Those are not the kind of numbers you'd expect from disabling a search indexer and removing a browser nobody liked anyway. Those are the kind of numbers that make people ask an uncomfortable question. How much performance has Windows been quietly costing all of us, all along, just by existing in its default state? But here's where it gets more complicated, because the real story isn't as simple as AtlasOS makes everything 50% faster. Independent testers who've actually run AtlasOS side by side with a stock Windows 11 install have reported something more nuanced. Idle RAM and CPU usage genuinely do drop, often significantly. In one widely cited hands-on test, the number of background processes on an old budget laptop fell from around 158 down to roughly 84, and idle memory usage dropped by hundreds of megabytes on a machine that only had 4 gigabytes total to work with in the first place. That's not nothing. On a resource-starved system, that is the difference between something feeling unusable and something feeling functional again. But raw benchmark numbers in heavier workloads don't always show a dramatic gap. The honest takeaway echoed by reviewers is that AtlasOS isn't primarily a raw speed upgrade. It's a removal of friction, a quieter, calmer, less interrupted experience. And for an enormous number of users, that turns out to matter more than a few extra frames per second ever could. Think about who that actually appeals to. It's not just gamers chasing frame rates, although competitive players absolutely benefit from a system that isn't randomly spawning background processes mid-match. It's the person running a 5-year-old laptop who can't afford a new one and is sick of waiting 20 seconds for the start menu to respond. It's the IT-literate parent trying to squeeze a few more years out of a family PC. It's the privacy-conscious user who has spent years trying to manually disable Windows telemetry, one registry key at a time, and finally found a tool that does it systematically, instead of through scattered forum advice. It's the handheld gaming PC owner running Windows on hardware with thermal and battery constraints Microsoft's default configuration was never built around. This is no longer a niche curiosity. This is a coalition of frustrations, finally finding a shared solution. And this is where everything changes, because once you understand who's adopting this, you have to ask the harder question. Why hasn't Microsoft built this itself? The answer isn't technical. Microsoft, unquestionably, has the engineering capability to ship a leaner Windows. The real answer is structural, and it has everything to do with how modern Windows actually makes money and maintains its ecosystem. Windows isn't just an operating system anymore, it's a distribution channel. Bing search inside the Start menu drives traffic and advertising data. Edge integration supports Microsoft's broader browser and advertising strategy. Telemetry feeds product decisions and, in aggregate, commercial partnerships. Copilot and AI-driven features across the shell are part of a company-wide strategic bet on AI as the next platform layer, and Microsoft is not going to build an official remove all our AI features and tracking mode for the exact same operating system it's trying to position as AI first. The bloat isn't a bug Microsoft hasn't gotten around to fixing. For a company with Microsoft's revenue model, much of it is a feature. This is not chaos, this is strategy. And once you see it that way, AtlasOS stops looking like a quirky enthusiast project and starts looking like something closer to a pressure release valve for an entire user base that has nowhere else to direct its frustration. Microsoft isn't going to remove Copilot from the taskbar by popular demand. It isn't going to stop nudging users toward Edge and Bing, because those products are part of a much larger strategic picture involving advertising revenue, AI platform positioning, and ecosystem lock-in that has nothing to do with what's best for a single user's CPU usage. So the people who wanted something different simply built it themselves in public for free and dared Microsoft to do something about it. What's remarkable is that, so far, Microsoft hasn't done much of anything about it. And that silence is its own kind of signal. AtlasOS operates in a legally careful zone because it doesn't distribute a modified Windows image and instead modifies a Microsoft licensed installation locally on the user's own machine. It sidesteps the kind of clear-cut redistribution violations that have gotten other lightweight Windows projects into trouble in the past. Projects that have tried to strip down Windows by distributing pre-modified ISOs have faced much murkier legal ground. AtlasOS's playbook-based approach, applied locally after a legitimate Windows installation, is a structurally different proposition, closer to a really aggressive settings configuration tool than to piracy. That distinction matters enormously, and it's a big part of why the project has been able to operate openly on GitHub, build a public Discord community, accept donations, and grow a genuine following instead of getting buried in takedown notices. But don't mistake legal caution for safety in every sense, because here's where the stakes climb again. Modifying core parts of an operating system this deeply is not risk-free, and the project itself is upfront about that. Disabling certain security features, removing built-in protections, and altering how Windows handles updates can leave systems more exposed if users aren't careful about which tweaks they apply. AtlasOS tries to handle this more responsibly than some of its rivals by leaving security-related choices in the user's hands rather than silently stripping protections away. and by continuing to allow cumulative security updates to flow through even while feature updates are paused. That's a meaningfully different philosophy than projects that hollow out Windows so aggressively that future updates become difficult or impossible. Still, the moment you start removing components, Microsoft built its update and compatibility assumptions around you accept a level of fragility that a stock Windows install simply doesn't carry. Anti-cheat systems in competitive games can behave unpredictably. Game Pass and Xbox-linked services can require extra setup. OneDrive integration, Windows Hello, certain enterprise tools, all of it sits in a slightly different relationship with a debloated system than with a stock one. And this is the trade-off nobody in the hype cycle wants to talk about loudly enough. Every layer of convenience Microsoft builds into modern Windows exists because some segment of users actually relies on it. Strip away widgets, and the people who liked glanceable weather and news lose that. Strip away background app suggestions, and the casual user who liked discovering new software loses that. Strip away automatic driver and codec installation, and suddenly you're the one responsible for finding and installing things Windows used to just handle quietly in the background. AtlasOS doesn't pretend otherwise. The honest framing from reviewers who've spent real time with it is consistent. Less built-in convenience, more manual responsibility. You gain control, you lose hand-holding. For a technically confident user, that trade is obviously worth it. For someone who just wants their laptop to work without thinking about it, it might not be. Now, here's the twist that turns this from a niche debloat tool into something with real momentum. AtlasOS isn't standing still. It just doesn't stay one step behind Windows updates. It keeps pace with them in ways that matter for anyone deciding whether this is a passing fad or a sustained movement. The project's most recent major release brought official support for Windows 11's 25H2 update, meaning AtlasOS isn't locked to an aging, increasingly outdated version of Windows while the rest of the world moves forward. That release also introduced something called ISO injection, a feature that streamlines how the debloating process integrates with the Windows installation itself, plus a dedicated AtlasOS toolbox, giving users more granular post-install control, rewritten configuration scripts, expanded options for things like Windows Hello and update management, and refinements that show this is being actively engineered, not abandoned after the initial buzz faded. Think about what that pace of development actually signals. Plenty of debloat Windows tools have appeared over the years, generated a wave of attention, and then quietly died as Microsoft pushed out an update that broke compatibility and nobody fixed it. AtlasOS, by contrast, has kept shipping. It has kept tracking new Windows feature updates. It has built out documentation, a forum, a Discord community, and even accepted community funding to sustain itself. That is the difference between a one-off hack and an actual ongoing project with infrastructure behind it. And the more sustained that infrastructure becomes, the harder it gets to dismiss this as a temporary curiosity that will simply evaporate the next time Microsoft changes its update architecture. So where does this actually leave Microsoft? This is where the real tension sits. It's worth sitting with for a moment instead of rushing past it. Every time a tool like AtlasOS gains visibility, every YouTube video, every Reddit thread, every tech outlet writing about how a community mod outperforms the official product on responsiveness and privacy, it becomes a little more public evidence that the friction in stock Windows isn't inevitable, it was designed in. And once enough people understand that distinction, it stops being just a performance conversation and starts becoming a trust conversation. What does it say about a company's relationship with its users when the most beloved version of its product is the one its own users had to build themselves without its help, working around its defaults rather than with them? There's a deeper irony buried in all of this, too. Microsoft has spent the last several years pushing Windows further toward an AI and cloud services platform, leaning into Copilot, deeper account integration, and features designed to keep users inside Microsoft's broader ecosystem. AtlasOS represents the opposite philosophical bet entirely, that the best version of Windows is the one that gets out of your way, asks for nothing, phones home to no one, and just runs your applications as fast and as quietly as the hardware allows. Two completely different visions of what an operating system should be, running on the exact same underlying code, separated only by which features got switched off. That split tells you something important about where consumer sentiment might actually be heading, even while the official product line moves in the opposite direction. And here's the part that should make this story feel bigger than just one community project. AtlasOS exists inside a broader pattern that's been building for years, a growing segment of users, gamers, privacy advocates, owners of older or budget hardware, people simply exhausted by being upsold inside their own operating system, actively rejecting the direction the biggest software company in the world has chosen for its flagship product. AtlasOS isn't isolated. Similar projects with names like Tiny11, Win11 Debloat, and others have emerged from the same frustration. each taking a slightly different approach to the same underlying complaint. Some strip more aggressively and break more things. Some are gentler but less effective. AtlasOS has positioned itself as the one trying to balance real performance gains, real privacy improvements, and real usability without breaking the things people actually depend on. And that balance appears to be exactly why it's the one breaking through into mainstream tech coverage instead of staying a forum footnote. But escalate the thinking one more level, because this is where it stops being purely a Windows story and becomes a question about platform power in general. If a volunteer community, working in their spare time with no corporate budget, no advertising department, and no access to Microsoft's internal codebase, can produce something that a meaningful number of real users prefer to Microsoft's own official build, what does that actually say about how much of modern software bloat is a deliberate business decision rather than a technical limitation? It says the limitation was never the engineering. It says the limitation was always the incentive structure. Microsoft could ship a light mode tomorrow if it decided that mattered more than the advertising, AI platform integration, and ecosystem stickiness those default features support. It hasn't, because right now those incentives still outweigh the complaints. The real story is not that Microsoft can't build this, it's that Microsoft has decided not to, and a community project just made that decision visible to everyone watching. So where does this go from here? That's the uncomfortable, unresolved part. And it's worth ending here, rather than pretending there's a clean conclusion. Does growing public attention on projects like AtlasOS eventually pressure Microsoft into rethinking how much is bundled into Windows by default, the way public backlash has occasionally forced reversals on other unpopular features in the past? Or does Microsoft simply continue tightening its update architecture in ways that make community de-bloating progressively harder, the same way platform owners in other industries have responded to unofficial modifications they can't fully control? Will AtlasOS's careful, license-respecting approach be enough to keep it operating safely long-term? Or is there a version of Windows update architecture coming that quietly closes the door this project has been walking through? And maybe the bigger question of all, if millions of users are choosing, video after video, install after install, to spend their own time and effort stripping away what one of the most powerful technology companies on Earth chose to build into its own product, what does that tell us about who actually still has control over the software running on a billion devices? Right now, nobody has a confident answer. But the fact that the question is even being asked out loud by ordinary users on ordinary laptops might be the most significant thing happening inside Windows this year.